The Committee on House Administration will come to order. I'd like to welcome our members. We have a quorum present. The ranking member, Mr. Raskin, Mr. Stile, Mr. Aguilar, Ms. Scanlon, and Ms. Fernandez. So we have a quorum, and I'd like to welcome everyone. As we begin, I want to note that we're holding this hearing in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. We ask committee members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted when not speaking to limit background noise, and members will need to unmute themselves when seeking recognition or when recognized for their question period. Witnesses will also need to unmute themselves when recognized when answering questions. We ask members and witnesses to keep cameras on at all times as the rule provides, even if you need to step away for a moment. And I'd like to remind members that the rules prohibit participation in more than one committee proceeding at the same time. At this time, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and have any written statements to be made part of the record. And hearing no objections, that is ordered. Today's hearing continues the oversight of this committee and the House of Representatives of issues related to January 6, 2021, the insurrectionist attack on the Capitol. Specifically, the scope of today's hearing is the latest flash report by the Inspector General for the U.S. Capitol Police, which was provided to Congressional Oversight Committees and the Department on April 30th. We appreciate the continued work of Inspector General Michael Bolton and his team, and we're grateful to welcome him back. This new flash report focuses on 2 particular issues: threat assessment and counter surveillance. But before we get to that, I want to take a moment to clarify what I think appeared to be some confusion the last time Mr. Bolton appeared before us. I asked a question that apparently some misinterpreted as a statement, but I was merely quoting from an officer who was part of an Office of Professional Responsibility review. It was not a review of the radio transmission. It was a quote from an officer who was interviewed, and I'd like to quote this officer directly. Quote, "I was originally drafted for CDU at 1,000 hours on January 6, 2021. I then swapped my starting time with another officer whose starting time was 0800 hours. I enjoyed being part of the CDU. A few minutes after our roll call, my squad was directed to help the East Front security posture at the Capitol Division. As I was crossing the street at Traffic 6, a radio broadcast was sent out to all outside unit. Quote, 'Attention, all unit on the field. We are not looking for any pro-Trump in the crowd. We're only looking for anti-pro-Trump who wants to start a fight.' At that point, I started thinking about my initial intelligence that was disseminated. The entire crowd was a threat based on the intelligence. The pro-Trump are the threat because they're coming to stop the count. However, I convinced myself that perhaps the mission has changed. The CDU that was scheduled at 1,000 hours was initially supposed to be part of our rotation. However, they were sent to parole garages around the House Division. At that point, I was convinced that the mission has changed and the threat was not a high-level threat because of the radio call and the decisions that were made to send the other group to patrol garages. I was at the East Front with officers. A small group, perhaps prior or still in the military, approached one officer and asked him if he wants to talk, because what is happening at the lower West Front terrace will happen at the East Front as well, and nothing will stop that. I automatically realized that there was a disconnect or a miscommunication about the event that is occurring today. And that's the point. We need to make sure that the threat assessments and the planning and the preparation were adequate for the event that was to present this huge challenge to our country and specifically to the officers who protected us. As Inspector General Bolton reported, he and his team have concluded to date that the department's threat assessment and counter-surveillance programs had a number of deficiencies, including operating under outdated or vague guidance, failure to adequately report stop or contact activities, lack of a dedicated counter-surveillance entity, and insufficient resources for supporting both threat assessment and counter-surveillance activities, among other shortcomings. We'll hear more about these issues and the Inspector General's recommendations for addressing these problems today. I continue to believe that Congress must establish a commission focused specifically on the January 6th insurrection. Such a review is necessary, even though I agree with Republicans like Senator Mitch McConnell, former Speaker John Boehner, and Representative Cheney that former President Donald Trump bears ultimate responsibility for inciting the dangerous and deadly insurrection. In the meantime, that will not deter the committee from continuing its work. To date, that work has included, among other things, coordinating with the Security Task Force led by Lieutenant General Russell Honoré and its distinguished team of experts, reviewing the task force's recommendations for improving security for Congress, and working with various inspector generals who are reviewing issues within their jurisdictions. Our committee's work with Inspector General has included the only public hearing of any congressional committee to date with Capitol Police Inspector General Michael Bolton. On Wednesday, we will be pleased to hear directly from the Inspector General for the architect of the Capitol about his first flash report on issues related to that agency. Furthermore, I plan to call a hearing to review overarching issues about the department's mission, organization, and oversight, including its relationship to the Capitol Police Board, and I intend to invite current members of the Capitol Police Board to testify at that hearing. As we begin this hearing, I note that this is the start of National Police Week. In years past, this annual commemoration of law enforcement from agencies and jurisdictions has included a large gathering on the west front of the Capitol to remember officers who've fallen in the line of duty and to thank all men and women who serve our nation and our communities in law enforcement. It's a perverse irony that this year, this important gathering will not be held in person because of the pandemic, which has killed more police officers in the past year than any other line of duty cause of death combined. Instead, the largest multi-jurisdictional gathering of law enforcement at the Capitol so far this year may well be that which occurred on January 6th, when officers from multiple departments responded to the insurrectionist attack. It was not just the Capitol Police who were under attack that day, it was also the men and women who answered their call for aid from the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, the Alexandria, Virginia Police Department, the Virginia State Police, the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the Secret Service, the U.S. Marshals, and the U.S. Park Police. These officers, as well as citizen soldiers of the National Guard, all answered the call to protect the Capitol. At our last hearing, I recounted some of the horrific injuries suffered that day by the responding officers. I noted that one officer was dragged into the crowd on the Capitol steps, viciously beaten, had his own taser taken from him, and used repeatedly against him to the point that he had a heart attack. Last week, that officer, Officer Michael Fanone, who serves in the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, sent a powerful open letter about his experiences addressed to all elected members of the United States government. That includes us. He details what happened to him that day, including how he was, quote, pulled into the crowd away from my fellow officers, beaten with fists, metal objects, stripped of my issued badge, radio, and ammunition magazine, and electrocuted numerous times with a taser. In his letter, Officer Fanone writes, quote, I struggle daily with the emotional anxiety of having survived such a traumatic event, but I also struggle with the anxiety of hearing those who continue to downplay the events of that day and those who would ignore them altogether with their lack of acknowledgement. His letter is a stark reminder of the plain facts of the events of that day. His attackers were not foreign terrorists, they were his fellow Americans, incited to insurrection and violence by the then President of the United States. I ask unanimous consent that Officer Fanone's May 5th, 2021 letter be entered into the record, and without objection, that is ordered. I want to say to all the officers of the Capitol Police and every jurisdiction who responded on January 6th, and to those who stand watch today, we remember and we honor your service. I'd also like to repeat something else I said at our last hearing. To all officers, Ledge Branch staff and members, counseling and other assistance is available to you, and you're encouraged to use those resources at any time. And now I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Davis from Illinois.